bad troops, poopy AI, underwhelming stats. There have been many troops in Clash of Clans that started out in the trenches and had to be buffed in order to get good. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 6 troops that had a pretty rough start and will later become a staple in many strategies. So, with that being said, let's get right into it.
Let's do this.
Bowler. You know what troop sucks when it gets buffed shortly after release, and the Bowler is a perfect example of this. Added in March 2016, the Bowler immediately became the laughingstock of that update. Almost no one was using the Bowler due to it having underwhelming stats for its housing space requirement of 8. The same as Valkyrie. The number 8 must be really bad luck in Clash of Clans. But that's it. The reason it sucked so bad was its housing space. That's all. The Bowler we all know and love today is not that much different from its launch, besides of course some minor stat buffs and nerfs over the years, but nothing too drastic except of course that housing space. About a month and a half after being in the game, the Bowler would get its first buff, making its first attack faster, similar to a buff the Valkyrie had just got a couple months prior. The hell you copying me for? Now, even though this made the Bowler slightly better, its damage and speed was not the problem at all. It wasn't until the end of May, 2 months after its launch, where they got an insane buff. Its housing space went from 8 to 6. Now, instead of laughing at the Bowler, everyone was laughing with the Bowler while they 3-starred every goddamn base. The housing space change was very aggressive and proved to be the one thing the Bowlers needed all along. People were beginning to put Bowlers in every ground strategy known to man. Even Bowlers by themselves were crazy as hell. The Bowler spam meta was nuts, but probably the most broken strategy after the buff was Bowler and Healer. Now, I'm not here to talk about strategies, but I did want to mention that the combo was so crazy, it was partially the reason the Healer got nerfed into oblivion that year. Oh, and so did the Bowler, but that's besides the point. Let bro have his moment. This was definitely one of the best come-up stories in Clash of Clans. Hog Rider. The Hog Rider is probably one of the most well-known cases of troops being bad at first and then exploding in popularity, and it all happened within its first 6 months in the game. Added in March 2013, the Hog was incredibly underwhelming. Not only did it take up more housing space than today, it also targeted any building while also doing less damage. It was a bad deal all around, but nonetheless, players at the time really tried to use this cool new troop that could jump over walls. It was unique and had a lot of potential. It wasn't like the Hog was useless either, don't get me wrong. Mass Hogs were already a thing before they could target defenses. It just wasn't as effective. Back then, instead of heal spells, people would bring a Rage because the Hogs weren't doing the job fast enough and they really needed it. But without the heals, this meant that the Hogs weren't exactly a reliable 3-star strategy either, unless you brang other troops. But then, on July 29, 2013, its housing space was reduced from 6 to 5, allowing players to bring more Hogs or other troops that would help make the strategy much more viable. But yet again, just a month later, the Hogs got reworked. They reworked so good, they spent the next year trying to nerf the hell out of them. No, really, the next year was just a bunch of nerfs. The new and improved Hog Rider now prioritized defenses and dealt 20% more damage. All of a sudden, the Hog was everywhere. It shredded through bases with ease. There was no defenses in the game that could handle 30 plus Hogs. By the time the defenses managed to take out like 5 or 10 of them, the whole base was gone. People were running out of ideas like how the hell do we defend against this? Sooner or later, the double giant bomb became a thing. The Hog went from an okay troop to needing an emergency nerf ASAP. But the icing on the cake was that players started to ditch the Rage spell because the Hog didn't need it anymore. So, mass Hogs and heal was now the new standard. And the rest, as they say, is history. Wall breakers. It's crazy to think that such an essential piece to most armies started off as a terrible troop. The Wallbreaker was present in the game's global launch. At the time, it had a housing space of 1, which may sound nice, but that's because its AI was, let's just say, not that good. The original Wallbreaker was programmed to go for any wall. Now, if you were attacking a normal base, the Wallbreaker did its job perfectly fine. It would go up to the wall and blow up. However, it didn't take long for players to notice that the Wallbreakers weren't heading toward the base because it's just because it was heading toward the nearest wall. And so eventually bases like these sprung up everywhere, bases with wall spikes. These bases were designed so that the Wallbreakers would target these spikes rather than the walls in the base, and it worked. The Wallbreakers didn't have a smart enough AI to avoid these spikes in the base, so for its first 8 months in the game, if you ran into a base like this, you were kinda screwed. Especially back then when there weren't really any troops that could break walls easily, except for maybe giants, I don't know. In March 2013, the Wallbreakers would finally get their long overdue rework, which made their AI significantly smarter, enough to avoid standalone walls like these spikes. In turn, its housing space was increased from 1 to 2. It's been like that ever since, and the Wallbreaker's been shining. It's a staple in a lot of armies. Balloon. Okay, the balloon didn't suck. I'm using the word a bit loosely here, but if you were playing in 2012 or early 2013, you'd know that there wasn't really any solid strategies around the balloon, and the troop itself even felt incomplete. The balloon was present in the game's global launch, and for the first 8 months, it went completely untouched. The most common use for the balloon seemed to be as a cleanup troop because there were no air traps, so if you had all of the air targeting defenses down, you could drop a balloon or two and let them freely fly around. The second most common use was spam it. Why am I not surprised? However, mass balloons in 2012 was sort of a novelty thing. It was pretty unreliable and oftentimes base dependent. I mean, you have to keep in mind there was no Lava Hound, no minions. The balloon didn't even do def damage. The only other air troops at the time were the dragon and the healer. You can see why the balloon was in a weird spot, and that's why I included it in this video. The balloon didn't have much going for it. But luckily for the balloon, this would all change at the beginning of 2013. It all started with the level 6 balloon in February 2013, then Dark Elixir troops were added in March, which included the minion, and in April, balloons were given a buff, being able to deal def damage. Within this 2-month time frame, the balloon went from sometimes being useful to being everywhere. The now recently buffed balloon paired really well with minions and marked the beginning of the Loonian strategy that would only get stronger through the years, with the Lava Hound in 2014 and a massive buff in 2016. Healer. There is no doubt that the healer sucked at first. From AI issues to requiring way too much housing space, the healer had a very rough start, and even to this day, they are still balancing the damn thing. The healer was present in the game's launch, requiring a massive 20 housing space. Now, at the time, this seemed to make sense, considering that the healer could not only heal your troops on offense, but also heal them and buildings on defense. However, despite being so capable of those things, players were not a big fan of a troop with the same housing space as a dragon, but with terrible AI. What made her AI so bad, by the way, was that it had a hard time sticking to a group of troops. A lot of the time, the healer would end up following like one giant or something. They also died pretty easily, and with 2 brand new air traps recently added in February 2013, it only made matters worse. Despite all of these issues though, players did use the healer with giants and wizards. That was their most common use. But in May 2013, not only did they add another level, its housing space went from 20 to 14. To my knowledge, that is the biggest housing space change that the game has ever had. From here on out, the healer slowly became more popular. She got buffed later that same year. Her AI was reworked in September 2014, making her targeting much better. And in February 2015, she no longer targeted air traps. Of course, that's not the end of the story. She's had tons of more balances throughout the years, but I think I've backed my point enough here. The healer started as a pretty bad support troop, but with a few buffs here and there, she just kept getting better and better, even having her own OP moments in the game's history. Apprentice Warden. Okay, it's a bit of a stretch to say that the Apprentice Warden sucked at release, but I think everyone can agree that originally it wasn't as useful, and its launch was at a rather confusing time. Added in June 2023, many people, including myself, assumed that the Apprentice was simply a miniature Grand Warden that was meant to replace him. Sometimes. I mean, the Apprentice aura did not stack with the Grand Warden, so you couldn't use them together. It seemed like the two most obvious use cases for it was if your Grand Warden was down, this was better than nothing, or used in combination with a hero walk or charge. But other than that, for 20 housing space, it just didn't seem worth it, you know? It was hard to justify including it in your army when we already had a whole ass Grand Warden specializing in what the troop did. However, since its launch, it's only gotten more popular, so much that it got nerfed toward the end of March 2024. The increased popularity of the Apprentice wasn't from balance changes, but rather hero equipment and a shift in the meta. Ever since the update of December 2023 with new Grand Warden equipment, the Life Gem and Eternal Tomb was no longer your only options. So all of a sudden, the Apprentice was not just a miniature Grand Warden anymore, it was a walking Life Gem. Now, you could pair it up with your Grand Warden. It could now take its place in the field while the Grand Warden was also in the field. But then the Root Riders came out in the same update, and the Apprentice would prove to be an essential part of the Root Rider meta. Love it or hate it, they were OP. Like every troop in this video, I think the Apprentice Warden had a pretty awesome success story, going from kind of irrelevant to having a real place in the meta. So guys, that wraps it up. Those are 6 troops that started off bad, but would later become really good. I almost wanted to talk about the Valkyrie again, but I don't know. I felt like I might sound like a broken record at that point. Let me know your thoughts down below. What are some troops that you think should have been on this list? As always, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching. Havoc Gaming outs. Peace.